Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to express my support for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as the New START Treaty, which was signed by President Obama and Russian President Medvedev on April 8, 2010, and would replace the START Treaty that expired on December 5, 2009. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I had the opportunity to review the implications of this treaty over the course of 5 hearings and multiple briefings. I am convinced that ratification of this treaty is essential to the security of the United States, not simply in the context of our relationship with Russia, but also in our efforts to counter proliferation throughout the world. As a starting point to consider this treaty, it is important to recognize that since December 5, 2009, when the START Treaty expired, we have not had inspectors on the ground in Russia to monitor their nuclear weapons complex. It wasn't until December 2008 that the Bush administration and Russia agreed that they wanted to replace START before it expired, but acknowledged that the task would have to be left to the Obama administration, leaving them 1 year before the treaty was set to expire so that they could begin these negotiations. The reality is that we haven't had a verification regime in place for inspectors on the ground in Russia for over a year. And every day that goes by without this treaty in place is another where the United States lacks the ability to verify effectively and in person and inspect Russian strategic nuclear forces. And if the Senate rejects this treaty, it may be many years, if ever, before we once again have American inspectors on the ground in Russia. President Obama stated, and I quote, "In the absence of START, without the New START Treaty being ratified by the Senate, we do not have a verification mechanism to ensure that we know what the Russians are doing. And when you have uncertainty in the area of nuclear weapons, that's a much more dangerous world to live in." The bottom line is this, frankly: if you don't trust the Russians, then you should be voting for this treaty, because that's the only way we're going to get, in a timely and effective way, American inspectors back on the ground looking at that nuclear complex. There's another aspect here. Without the New START Treaty in place, there is an additional strain on our intelligence network to monitor Russia's activities. In his testimony to the Armed Services Committee, General Kevin Chilton, commander of STRATCOM, stated, quote, "Without New START, we would rapidly lose some of our insights into Russian strategic nuclear force developments and activities. We would be required increasingly to focus low-density, high-demand intelligence collection and analysis assets on Russian nuclear forces. These intelligence assets include our satellites, which are already in high demand, particularly in our operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as in emerging threat locations like Yemen, Somalia, and the Pacific. Furthermore, these national technical means can never supplant the quality of intelligence gathered from on-site inspections by American weapons experts in verifying the quantity, type, and location of Russia's nuclear arsenal." Dr. James Miller, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, remarked, "On-site inspectors are a vital complement to the data that the United States will receive under New START. They provide the boots-on-the-ground presence to confirm the validity of Russian data declarations and to add to our confidence and knowledge regarding Russian strategic forces located at facilities around the country." The failure to ratify may present a significant operational cost to our efforts in the war on terrorism. To compensate for a lack of treaty, our satellite assets could be shifted to maintain some coverage on Russia, which in short run would deny the capability of looking at other places like Sudan or Yemen, where we know that al-Qaeda and its affiliates are establishing sanctuaries. In the longer term, we may consider putting up new satellites, a tremendous cost that would be difficult to bear in a continuing budget crisis, and one that would not give us the same kind of information as having inspectors on the ground. Let me just once again emphasize this. If this treaty goes unratified, if we do not have inspectors on the ground, then we must rely on what is known as our national technical means of verifications, significantly satellites. Those are, as General Chilton said, high demand assets. And if they're being flown over Russia, and I can't conceive, if we let this treaty lapse over several years, that military commanders will just feel confident not putting more and more satellites over Russia. That takes away from efforts right now to monitor trouble spots around the globe, and is a real cost to the failure to ratify this treaty. Ratifying this treaty is also a vital part of our relationship with Russia. It is the essential element in the process of controlling nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia. And I want to quote my esteemed colleague and the manager on the Russian side, Senator Lugar, who has long been not only a leader in this effort, but someone whose vision and whose actions already, particularly through his work with Senator Sam Nunn, has made this world a much, much safer place, and one whose debt nationally we all are in, and I thank you for that. But Senator Lugar stated on the floor this week, we should not be cavalier about allowing our relationship with Moscow to drift, or about letting our knowledge of Russian weaponry atrophy. He's right, as he has been right on so many issues with respect to national and international policy. This process also has a long history of bipartisan support, from the first formal agreement with the Soviet Union under the Carter administration that limited nuclear offensive and defensive weapons, through both terms of President Reagan's administration, which produced the original START Treaty, to the overwhelming support in the Senate to ratify these important agreements. All of these agreements had bipartisan strong support. This treaty is an important part of renewing our relationship with Russia and will provide the foundation for negotiations on other nuclear issues. Ellen Tauscher, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, has stated, "It's my calculation that we need to get this done now, because every day that we don't is a day that will not only don't we have boots on the ground, but it's also a day that we can't move on to other parts of the agenda." This was the New START Treaty, but it is also the start of the reset of the relationship, and it is a very big agenda. We have other issues. Tactical nuclear devices, which the Russians may have and former countries in the Soviet Union may have. We have a whole set of issues. We have issues with respect to Iran, to North Korea. If we can ratify this treaty, we now have momentum to move forward on these other issues. But we all know that the proliferation of nuclear weapons threatens more than the security of just Russia and the United States. Indeed, this treaty is central to the continued need for a worldwide effort to control nuclear weapons. It is every president's worst nightmare that somewhere in the world a nuclear accident will occur. A rogue state will attain nuclear capability, or a nuclear weapon or materials will fall in the hand of a terrorist group. This treaty is an important step toward reducing the number of nuclear weapons around the world, and demonstrates to the international community that the United States and Russia are committed to this goal. If we don't ratify this agreement and don't continue this 40-year process of working with Russia on limiting nuclear weapons, how can we get them to assist us effectively in addressing the nuclear ambitions of North Korea and Iran? What credibility will we have among the international community to restrain Iran's development of nuclear weapons if it's perceived that we have abandoned a long-lasting, long-term, and so far mutually beneficial attempt with the Russians to limit our nuclear weapons? We must do everything possible to counter proliferation, through containment, through interdiction, through a host of different programs. Again, and I want to quote Senator Lugar, in his words, "This process must continue if we are to answer the existential threat posed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Every missile destroyed, every warhead deactivated, and every inspection implemented makes us safer. Russia and the United States have the choice whether or not to continue this effort, and that choice is embodied in the New START Treaty." We also understand, too, that as long as we have nuclear weapons, we have to have an effective nuclear arsenal. In its FY 2011 budget, the Obama administration requested $7 billion for the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, which oversees the U.S. nuclear complex. This request is about 10% more than the previous year's budget. That is a significant increase for any department in this government, particularly as we face challenging economic times and an increased deficit. Indeed, Linton Brooks, the former NNSA administrator under President George W. Bush, said, "I'd have killed for that kind of budget and that much high-level attention in the administration." So the issue of dealing with our nuclear arsenal is being addressed with more energy and more resources and more attention than it was in the preceding administration. And I don't think that that argument can be used as an attempt to delay the ratification of this treaty. Many have argued that before we consider the treaty, we must commit to substantial funding increases in the future budgets to modernize the nuclear infrastructure. We are doing that. And while I support the need to ensure a safe and reliable nuclear arsenal, and I applaud the Obama administration's efforts to commit significant resources to do so, we have to recognize that this is a recent change. In fact, the Obama administration is not only bringing this treaty to the Senate, it's also bringing to the Congress a level of commitment that was lacking previously. And I think both of those are necessary, and both of those mutually reinforce one another, and together are strong support for the ratification of this treaty. During an Armed Services Committee hearing in July, I asked the directors of the national labs about the significant commitment of resources this administration has made to the nuclear enterprise. Dr. George Miller, the director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, responded, "It is clearly a major step in the right direction. The budget has been declining since about 2005, and this represents a very important and significant turnaround." The Obama administration has also outlined an $85 billion 10-year plan for NNSA nuclear weapons activities, which includes an additional $4.1 billion in spending for fiscal years 2012 through 2016. The $85 billion represents a 21% rise above the fiscal 2011 spending level. As Secretary of Defense Robert Gates wrote in his preface to the April 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, these investments and the NPR strategy for warhead life extension represent a credible modernization plan necessary to sustain the nuclear infrastructure and support our nation's deterrent. Ratifying this treaty presents us with the opportunity to recommit ourselves to preserving and reinvesting in our nuclear enterprise, including the highly trained workforce which is so necessary. But again, ratifying this treaty is such an essential part of our national security that it both complements and in some cases transcends simply reinvesting in our modernization efforts. But we are doing that. And that should give, I think, comfort to those who see that as an issue which may, and I don't think so, present some inhibition in ratifying this treaty. In all the discussion we've had on the content of this treaty, we've often failed to note the caliber and professionalism of the American negotiators who worked tirelessly on this treaty. This elite cadre of experts devoted their lives to serving our nation in promoting nuclear arms control, and doing it from very wise, very experienced, and I think very critical notions of what is necessary to protect the United States, because that is their first and foremost responsibility. This impressive team consisted of State Department negotiators, representatives from the Department of Defense's Joint Staff, from STRATCOM, our military command that is responsible for all these nuclear devices. Most of them took part in the development of START I and the subsequent treaties. They've had the experience of years and years of dealing with the Russians, of understanding the strengths and the weaknesses of our approaches. They captured these lessons learned on what we need to know about the Russian nuclear enterprise and the best means of achieving our national strategic objectives. This was not the labor of amateurs This was the work of people who've devoted their lifetime to try to develop an effective nuclear regime involving inspections, verification. They know more about what the Russians do and vice versa than anyone else. They were at the heart of these negotiations. Many of the principles behind this treaty are, as a result, complex and nuanced. Most Americans, frankly, and indeed many of our colleagues, don't have the means to invest the time to become versed in launches, telemetry, verification regimes. These individuals have spent their lives doing it. And we're quite fortunate that they have committed themselves to this enterprise, and they have produced this treaty as much as anyone. Furthermore, former Secretaries of State and Defense from both Republican and Democratic administrations and military commanders, including 7 previous commanders of STRATCOM. These are the military officers whose professional lives have been devoted to protecting America and commanding every unit that has a nuclear capability. They've all urged us to support this START treaty. That is a very, I think, strong endorsement as to the effectiveness of this treaty and the need for this treaty. All of them understand that this is in our best national security interest. Again, all of the commanders, all of the individuals who have spent every waking hour as commander, and indeed probably sleepless nights thinking about their responsibilities for nuclear weapons, their use, consider this treaty essential. That, I think, should be strong evidence for its ratification. As I mentioned before, the New START treaty builds upon decades of diplomacy and agreements between the United States and Russia. The New START treaty is appropriately structured to address the present conditions of our nuclear enterprise and national security interests, while building on the lessons we've learned from decades of previous treaty negotiations, from decades of implementing treaties, of finding out what works on the ground, and setting non-proliferation goals for the future. And it's important, I think, to understand how we got to today. The United States and the Soviet Union signed their first formal agreements limiting nuclear offensive and defensive weapons in May 1972, the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, known as SALT. Produced 2 agreements: the interim agreement on certain measures with respect to the limitation of strategic offensive arms, and the Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems. In 1979, these agreements were followed by the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT II, which sought to codify equal limits on U.S. and Soviet strategic offensive nuclear forces. However, President Carter eventually withdrew this treaty from Senate consideration due to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. Throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration participated in negotiations on the development of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty, and it was ultimately signed in 1998. At the negotiations, the Reagan administration called for a double-zero option, which would eliminate all short as well as long-range INF systems, intermediate systems, a position that at the time was viewed by most observers as unattractive to the Soviets. President Reagan also worked extensively to reduce the number of nuclear warheads, which led to the signing by President George Herbert Walker Bush the initial START Treaty of July 1991. Again, the work of President Reagan, the work of President George Herbert Walker Bush, all led to the historic START I Treaty. It limited long-range nuclear forces, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. START also contained a complex verification regime. Both sides collected most of the information needed to verify compliance with their own satellites and remote sensing equipment, known as the National Technical Means of Verification. But the party also used data exchanges, notifications, and on-site inspections to gather information about forces and activities limited by the treaty. Taken together, these measures were designed to provide each nation with the ability to deter and detect military significant violations. The verification regime and the cooperation needed to implement many of these measures instilled confidence and encouraged openness among the signatories. The original START Treaty was ratified by the Senate in October 1992 by the vote of 93-6. We are building, literally, on the path-breaking work of President Ronald Reagan and President George Herbert Walker Bush, limiting these classes of systems, using national means of technology, putting inspectors on the ground, and I find it ironic that we might be on the stage of turning our back on all that work, of walking away from a bipartisan consensus, 93-6. I don't think that would be in the best interest of this country. Now, in January 1993, the United States and Russia signed START II, which would further limit warheads. After some delay, the treaty eventually received approval by the Senate in January of 1996, but it never entered into force, mainly because of the United States withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in June of 2002. But once again, there was another effort along these same lines to further limit numbers of launches and warheads, and in that same spirit that today we have this new START Treaty before us. During a summit meeting with President Putin in November 2001, President Bush, George W. Bush, announced that the United States would reduce its operationally deployed strategic nuclear warheads to a level between 1,700 and 2,200 warheads during the next decade. He stated that the United States would reduce its forces unilaterally without signing a formal agreement. However, President Putin indicated that Russia wanted to use a formal arms control process, emphasizing that the two sides should focus on reaching a reliable and verifiable agreement and a legally binding document. Yet the Bush administration wanted to maintain the flexibility, size, and structure of its nuclear forces in response to its own needs and preferred a less formal process. The United States and Russia ultimately did sign the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, also known as the Moscow Treaty, on May 24, 2002. The United States Senate ratified the treaty on March 6, 2003 by a vote of 95-0. And the Russian Duma approved the treaty also. Once again, a high-level arms treaty negotiated by President George W. Bush with the Russians came to this floor and was unanimously approved. In mid-2006, the United States and Russia began to discuss their options for arms control after START. However, the two countries were unable to agree on a path forward. Neither side wanted to extend START in the original form. Russia wanted to replace START with a new treaty that would further reduce deployed forces while using many of the same definitions and counting rules in START. The Bush administration initially did not want to negotiate a new treaty, but would have been willing to extend informally some of the START's monitoring provisions. President Bush and President Putin agreed at the Sochi summit in April 2008 that they would proceed with negotiating a new legally binding treaty. As I mentioned before, it really wasn't until December 2008 that the two sides agreed to replace START before it expired, but acknowledged this task would fall to the Obama administration. And this administration took that work seriously and diligently and produced a treaty, and now it is our not only opportunity, but I believe obligation to ratify that treaty. Some of my colleagues have already described the provisions of the New START Treaty. Let me suggest some of the important details. Under the New START Treaty, the United States and Russia must reduce the number of their strategic arms within 7 years from the date the treaty enters into force. This treaty sets a limit of 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. All warheads on deployed ICBMs and deployed SLBMs count towards this limit, and each deployed heavy bomber equipped for nuclear armaments counts as one warhead toward the limit. This limit is 74% lower than the limit of the 1991 START Treaty. And again, let me stop, and I think if you asked every American, would we be safer with fewer nuclear warheads in the strategic forces of Russia and the United States, the answer would be yes. I think we've all recognized the potential danger of the existence of more than enough nuclear weapons to wreak havoc if they were somehow launched. The New START Treaty also sets a limit of 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launches, SLBM launches, and heavy bombers. It's on warheads, but also launching systems. Puts separate limits on deployed ICBMs, and deployed SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers. And the limit, again, is less than half the limit established by the 1991 START Treaty for deployed nuclear delivery vehicles. And the sooner we ratify this treaty, the sooner these limitations will be in place and can be enforced. We're at a point, I think, where we can continue the progress that began, the breakthrough really began, with President Reagan, President George Herbert Walker Bush, to a degree, at least in spirit, carried on with the Moscow Treaty by President George W. Bush, and now can be ratified with legally binding terms in this New START Treaty. Once ratified, the New START Treaty will be enforced for 10 years, unless superseded by a subsequent agreement. And of course, the U.S. and Russia have the option to extend the treaty for a period of no more than 5 years. And there are withdrawal clauses if we feel our national security requires such withdrawal. Furthermore, the 2002 Moscow Treaty will terminate with the adoption of this START Treaty. Like the first START Treaty, the New START Treaty establishes a complex verification and transparency regime that will guard against cheating and will enable the U.S. to monitor Russia's compliance with the treaty's terms. The treaty's verification measures build on the lessons learned during the 15 years of implementing the 1991 START Treaty and adds new elements tailored to the limitations of this treaty and to the application of this treaty. Indeed, Assistant Secretary of State Rose Gottmoeller, the head of the U.S. negotiating delegation, stated, "Much was learned over the 15 years in which the START Treaty verification regime was implemented, and the United States and Russia sought to take advantage of that knowledge in formulating the verification regime for the new treaty, seeking to maintain elements which proved useful, to include new measures where necessary, improve those measures that were an unnecessary drag on our strategic forces, and eliminate those that were not essential for verifying the obligations of the New START Treaty." And these verification measures include on-site inspections, which we do not have at the moment, data exchanges, which we do not have at the moment, and notifications, as well as provisions to facilitate the use of national technical means for treaty monitoring. To increase confidence and transparency, the treaty also provides for the exchange of telemetry information. Under the terms of the treaty, the parties are required to exchange data on the numbers, locations, and technical characteristics of deployed and non-deployed strategic arms that are subject to the treaty. The parties also agree to assign and exchange unique identification numbers for each deployed and non-deployed ICBM, SLBM, and nuclear-capable heavy bomber. We literally now will have the serial numbers which we can monitor of all their deployed systems. The treaty also establishes a notification regime to track the movement and change in status of strategic arms. Through these notifications and the unique identification numbers, the U.S. will be better able to monitor the status of Russian arms throughout their life cycle. The New START Treaty will also allow each party to conduct up to 18 on-site inspections each year. These inspections will include deployed and non-deployed systems at operating bases, as well as non-deployed systems at storage sites, test ranges, and conversion/elimination facilities. These on-site inspections will help verify and confirm the information provided in the data exchanges and notifications, ensuring that Russia is staying within the limits of the treaty. Some have asked, why have a treaty if Russia is allowed to cheat? It is important to remind ourselves of several points. First, because of the commitment under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, Russia has also already been operating under tighter constraints than the United States. They are signatories to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In 1996, President Clinton and President Yeltsin signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Russian Duma approved the treaty, but we have yet to ratify the treaty. So the Russians, indeed, are operating under more constraints with respect to comprehensive testing than we are. Second, over a year has passed since the expiration of the original START treaty. And again, since that time, there have been no verifications, no inspection, no process in place to work with Russia. It seems ironic to me that people are worrying about signing a treaty and having the Russians cheating are not preoccupied with the issue of what are the Russians doing today since we can't verify it. It doesn't seem to me to make sense to say the way you eliminate cheating is eliminate the laws so they can't cheat. So again, I think the logic as well as the history as well as the details of this treaty are compellingly persuasive that we have to ratify this treaty. Undersecretary of State Ellen Tarsher stated also, the urgency to verify the treaty is because we currently lack verification measured with Russia. The longer that goes on, the more opportunity there is for misunderstanding and mistrust. And third, there's a letter to Senator Kerry addressing concerns about cheating from Secretary Gates. And let me at this point commend the senator from Massachusetts for his extraordinary leadership on this issue. No one knows more about the details of this treaty, the ramifications, the nuances, than Senator Kerry. No one has been more articulate. No one, I think, has talked with more wisdom, more experience, and more compelling logic than the senator from Massachusetts when it comes to the ratification of this treaty. And for his leadership, I thank him profoundly. Thank you, Senator. But Secretary Gates wrote to Senator Kerry to remind us that the survivability and flexibility of U.S. strategic posture planned for New START will help deter any future Russian leaders from cheating or break out from the treaty, should they ever have such an inclination. Signing, ratifying the New START treaty will actually provide the right incentive structure to prevent cheating rather than to encourage it. Let me conclude. Let me again remind my colleagues that this treaty will provide a significantly increased degree of certainty in a very uncertain world. It will continue our relationship with Russia, one that we've forged over decades and one that we must use, not just for our mutual benefit, but to act against even more pressing threats like North Korea, like Iran, and like thousands of other emerging threats over the next several years. This treaty will allow us to advance our counterproliferation initiatives across the globe. And as such, I urge my colleagues to support ratification of the New START treaty. And I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Rhode Island. I first of all thank him for his generous comments on a personal level, but let me thank him for his work. I think everybody in the Senate will agree he is, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, one of the most respected voices in the Senate, one of the most diligent, hardworking members of that committee, and he knows and understands our weapons systems, our military needs, our security concerns, as well as anybody in the United States Senate. So I value enormously the history that he provided in his discussion today. I think it's an important predicate to this debate, and I really thank him for his work very, very much and for the comments that he made on the floor.